Um, Good evening, everybody. My name is Khaled Fahmy. I'm the chair of the History Department at the American University in Cairo. I welcome you all this afternoon to a lecture by our distinguished visiting professor, Timothy Mitchell. Before I introduce Professor Mitchell, I want to extend my thanks first to our co-organizers of this event, the Middle Eastern Studies Center and its director, Shireen Saikali, at the back, to the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Science, Dean Bruce Ferguson here, and to the AUC Provost, Amr Sha'rawi, sitting up front, under whose auspices the program of distinguished visiting professors are organized each year. It gives me enormous pleasure on a personal level, on an institutional level, and on a national level. I'm going to speak about these three things in 2 minutes or 3 minutes. I'm not going to take much of your time. To introduce a very dear friend and a colleague, Timothy Mitchell, who is the professor and chair of the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies in Columbia University, MISAS, as it is called. A department that he formed and concocted and shaped after leaving NYU, where he taught for many years. Professor Mitchell is a recipient of a PhD from Princeton University in politics, although, as you'll probably hear tonight, much of his work is to critique, among many other things, the very discipline of political science as we know it. Professor Mitchell's first book, Colonizing Egypt, which has been translated to Arabic, a brilliant translation by partly Bashir Sibai, sitting up front here. We're very happy to have him here. Colonizing Egypt, when you read about Mitchell's own biography, and when he talks about this book, he says that he's been a frequent visitor to Egypt. He knows Egyptian politics. He's interested in it. He wanted to study it. He thought he would study it by going to Princeton Political Science Department, or the Department of Politics. And he was stunned to discover that it's good old-fashioned American positivism there. And this is not what he wanted to study. He started his interest in working on Egypt and Egyptian politics and Middle Eastern politics, as he very often describes, just in the wake of Edward Said's book, just been published. Foucault has just been translated. You're getting your teeth into Derrida and Heidegger, grow up with Marx, and the result of all of these big minds is Colonizing Egypt. If you're ever interested in knowing about Foucault, I tell my students, or Derrida, or Heidegger, or Marx, or how to fuse all of these together in a meaningful, original, insightful, creative, useful way. What better way to do this than read Colonizing Egypt? On a personal level, if Mitchell has been, his PhD project has been shaped by Foucault and Derrida and Heidegger and Marx, my research project has been shaped by Tim Mitchell. I started my PhD project just after Colonizing Egypt had been published, or I discovered it in the middle of doing my archival research here in the National Archives of Egypt. And then I read this study. It was, with no exaggeration, all my students know this, it changed my life to the better. A wonderful opening with some people. This book was so intimidating as to say, if this is what research is, if this is how things could be done properly, there's no way I can match this. Thankfully, this did not happen to me. It was an open vistas of wonderful areas of research and thinking and questions that if I can just engage with one of them, that will be very useful. And the result is that about 8 months of my research in the archives were dropped, and I said, no, this doesn't make any sense. Let's start all over again. Started a new phase of archival research, very much shaped by my reading of Foucault and Derrida via Tim Mitchell. He's the one who told me and showed me how one can make use of these studies and of these amazing ideas. The result is a brilliant book that uses Egypt as a site to interrogate and redefine some basic terms as colonialism, the state, culture, politics, in a most lucid and subtle way. On an institutional level, we've been talking throughout the day today about AUC and how to restructure, how to rethink. And one of the amazing things about Tim is that in addition to his insights and his amazing critique, he's also a builder. He's a builder of institutions, and he knows the intricate link between the institutional setup of a university, of a college, of a school, and the kind of knowledge, the kind of information, the kind of insights that can be produced out of it. In my work at NYU, I was lucky to have Tim as the director of the Near Eastern Studies Center, the Kevorkian Center, and then later on the International Center for Advanced Studies, two institutions that he shaped very much with the idea of how we can reconfigure things in a way that can raise new questions, ask new questions, make people think about new kinds of research projects. He knows exactly the kind of limitations that departments and disciplines of political science or economics, and that is very much reflected in his second big book, Rule of Experts, which invites us to ask very deep questions about these experts, not only the engineers. You don't talk much about doctors, but social scientists who claim to have an answer and a definition of the societies we live in, when in fact they very much shape it. So that link between institutional setup and knowledge production is something that Tim is very good at. And then finally, these two books are about Egypt. The third book is not about Egypt, but it is a book that I think is very relevant to read now in Egypt's history and it's Egypt's revolutionary history, because it's a book that invites us, Carbon Democracy, to again rethink not the old question about the connection, the Dutch disease kind of question, the connection between oil and politics in the traditional way, the curse of oil argument, but ask very deep questions about politics, about the state, about culture, and as he said a couple of days ago, without ever mentioning these terms. So please join me in thanking and welcoming Tim Mitchell.
Thank you, Khaled, for that extraordinary, generous and exaggerated introduction, but let me in turn say how enormously fortunate we were to have you with us in New York for those 11 years where we were colleagues together at NYU, and to recognize, on the one hand, of course, the enormous importance of your work as a historian of modern Egypt and the significance of your return here, and to do the work and continue the work you'd already been doing of building a new generation of historians of Egypt, and in particular of Egyptian historians of Egypt, but also to show us how important history is to thinking about the present, and particularly at a moment when the present is such an exciting and transformative one. I also want to join Khaled in thanking my friend Bashir Sabai, who's not only found me when I was a young thing, read Colonizing Egypt and took it and translated it, but I haven't been able to bump into him since in the succeeding 25 years, or however many, without him wanting to get into conversation about what I was doing. And as a result of that, I've actually managed to author more books in Arabic than in English, because he throws together bits of things that I've written and turns them into these wonderful books. And with Sharif Yunus, thanks to them, a translation of the new book, Carbon Democracy, will be out in a few weeks. So thank you very much, Bashir. I could summarize the argument of this book, Carbon Democracy, by saying that coal created the possibility of modern democracy and oil set its limits. Now, one of those limits has been much discussed over the last decade. About the time of the US invasion of Iraq, there was an increase in discussions of the question of the fact that oil seemed to be very bad for democracy. The oil curse. Studies showing that countries that depended on very large oil revenues for the revenues of the state, export revenues for the revenue of the state, tended, it seemed, to be less democratic. But the attempts to explain that seemed to me completely unsatisfactory. And one of the reasons for that was they didn't actually talk about the oil. All they tend to do was talk about the money that the oil was turned into, and then talk about a variety of problems of what people did with that excess of money. And I think that jump very quickly from the oil itself and from thinking about oil and what it is and how it works to the money reflects a certain conception of democracy. Soon after the US invasion of Iraq, there was a US democracy expert. Many of them, of course, turned up there just as they did here a couple of years ago. And according to one account, this democracy expert was addressing a meeting of one of the new provincial councils somewhere in southern Iraq, somewhere in the middle of 2003, and he sat down in front of his audience of local notables and said to them, "Welcome to your new democracy. I have met you before. I have met you in Cambodia. I have met you in Russia. I have met you in Nigeria." At which point we're told 2 or 3 people walked out. The point is that for a democracy expert, of course, democracy is essentially the same thing everywhere. It's a set of rules, it's a set of procedures, and each example of democracy is a copy, is, if you like, a carbon copy of the other ones. And in order to be democratic, you have to put in place those rules, those procedures that will make democracy more or less the same everywhere. That, I think, in turn reflects a notion of a way of thinking about democracy, this set of principles, this set of rules, as essentially an idea, something that exists initially and importantly in people's heads. And it is its existence as an idea, as an ideal, that allows it to travel around the world and allows experts to travel with it. Now, I don't dispute the importance of certain rules and procedures, but I think there's something much more to what democracy is. I think it's not enough to have the rules, the procedures, the ways of electing people to do things for you. What also matters, and what is even more important, is ways of having people listen after you've elected them to what you want. I'm just getting signals, I think, to slow down for the translation, so that's why I'm pausing. And that ability to get people to listen to what you want depends on some kind of effective procedure for making that happen. Let me explain what that means by talking about the history of oil, and the history of oil in relation to the history of coal. And it's because of coal and oil together and the usefulness of thinking about them together that I'm using the term carbon democracy, carbon being a term that can refer to both those forms of energy. There's some simple connections that can be made between oil and democracy. In fact, I could make a very simple one. I could draw a map of oil production in the Arab world and of the rate of oil production in each of the countries of the region and whether it was rising or falling. And I could use just 3 colors to distinguish 3 different kinds of countries depending on their rates and amounts of oil production. And with those 3 colors, I would have a map of the revolutionary process in the Arab world. I'll come back to that, because I don't want to actually lay things out on such a simple level. I think one has to start thinking in a larger way of the relationship between oil and democracy, and the problems that oil presents for democracy, not only in regions where a lot of it is produced, but also in the regions where it is consumed. One can think, for example, in thinking in terms of the industrialized countries of the West, of 2 or 3 ways in which oil has presented and continues to present problems for democracy. One simple one that is increasingly apparent at the moment is the problem that is referred to as, thinking of a graph, as peak oil, as the notion that, at least when one looks at conventional forms of oil, the ability of the world to produce oil, the rate at which it can produce, has reached a peak, and is perhaps on a plateau along that peak, from which it is never going to be able to significantly climb higher, and going forward, there will only be decline. The peak, reaching this peak, reflects the fact that there's maybe 4 trillion barrels of oil available in the earth, and we've used up half of it so far in the 150 odd years since the oil was first produced on a large scale. It also reflects the fact that producing the first of those 2 trillions took about 130 years, and we went through the second trillion in just 22 years. The question of how one moves to a world beyond the use of carbon energy, beyond the use of coal, is an enormously important one, not just because there's going to be less of it available and it's going to go up enormously in price, but also because of a second and much larger issue, the issue of global warming, the issue of the threat of the collapse of the climate system that has made possible not just industrial society, but human collective life in general. Because, of course, in burning all that oil, and a lot of coal as well, we've taken the carbon from those forms of energy and put it in the atmosphere, where it is threatening catastrophic forms of climate change. So one can talk about those kinds of problems that oil presents to democracy everywhere. But I think one can also talk more specifically about a way in which the history of oil in relation to the democracy in the West has actually been very closely linked to the history of oil and democracy in other regions of the world, including the Arab region. And think about the ways in which oil has been, if you like, a de-democratizing force, not only in places that produce a lot of it, but also in particular ways I'll talk about, in places that use a lot of it. Let me begin, in order to explain what's distinctive about oil, by going back in history about 100 years and talk about coal and democracy. It's a fairly straightforward thing to say that there's a very close relationship between the development of coal as an enormously powerful source of energy and the rise of modern industrial democracy. There's nothing novel in saying that. The enormously concentrated energy brought out of the ground, its use to power steam engines, and the use of those steam engines then to drive industry, of course, gave rise to the Industrial Revolution, and by the end of the 19th century to very large-scale industrialization, to the accumulation of large populations in cities, to the rise of labor unions, and to the ability of those unionized workers and others to struggle for mass democracy. What I think is often missed in those accounts of coal and democracy is precisely how that happened. It wasn't just that a lot of people came together or that there was a lot of money at stake. There was a very specific way in which ruling classes in the West, in the industrialized countries, became vulnerable to popular pressure. And it worked as follows. What was different between older sources of energy and coal was the enormous concentration of the movement of energy along very, very narrow routes. Before coal, of course, energy was all solar energy. in the sense that if you grew crops or raised animals or used water power or used wind power, you were using forms of energy that derive their force almost directly from the sun. With those forms of energy, of course, are very, very widely dispersed. Coal was not only a vastly more concentrated source of energy, it was a source of energy that, because of that, came from very specific locations where it was buried underground and then moved along very narrow networks, those of the modern railway system, which was built largely to move coal in the first place. And from there to docks where it had to be unloaded and distributed. What happened was that created a very vulnerable system, one that was capable of enormous wealth, of production of enormous amounts of material goods, but one that turned out to be extremely easy to disrupt. It gave rise to the possibility, for the first time in history, and only for a very brief period, of what came to be known as the general strike. As late as the 1870s, Frederick Engels ridiculed the idea of organizing a general strike. He couldn't imagine workers would ever be powerful enough to do that, and he said if they were, they wouldn't bother because they'd already be more powerful than the state, and a strike would be a detour. They'd already control everything. He couldn't imagine the possibility that was to emerge within only a decade or so of relatively small groups of workers, but connected together over a large area by the fact that they were all involved in the movement of coal. And they could shut down the energy system of an entire country. That was never possible in the past, and it was actually only possible for about 50 years going forward, from the 1880s to the 1990s through to about the 1950s. Out of that pressure, out of the threat of the general strike, governments in the West, one by one, between the late 19th century and through the middle decades of the 20th century, gave in a series of democratic concessions. First of all, the right to vote, and then once the right to vote was given, the right to unionize, the right to use that power of unionizing to demand basic levels of minimum wages, of security, of unemployment benefit, of health insurance, of pensions in old age, the entire system of welfare and benefit that came into being in the early 20th century and moved many populations into a much less precarious form of collective life. And when I think of democracy, I think of that broader kind of ability to argue and organize and fight for less precarious forms of life. Oil was different. Why was oil different? It's not because people who became involved in oil production didn't make very similar struggles. And we now know, thanks to the work of many historians, the efforts of Iraqi oil workers, the oil workers of Iran, the oil workers of Saudi Arabia, who in the 40s and 50s were organizing strikes demanding a political constitution, an end to US air bases in the country, a set of political rights, unionization, and many other political demands. They didn't have the success that those same demands had in the countries of the West a generation or two generations before. Why not? Well, one simple reason is that they came second, and as a second source of energy after coal, oil, when it came into widespread use, was being produced at a point that was very dislocated from the place where it was mostly being used. So just the ability of workers at one site, the production site, to link up with those at another site, even just a site where it's unloaded in the industrial country, was much more difficult. You're spread out over a much, much larger network of energy distribution, and those tight linkages that were made possible by coal are not possible with oil. There's also the fact that oil is liquid. You don't have to send people underground to get it. It comes up on its own pressure. It needs far fewer workers on the surface. Once it's on the surface, being liquid, you move it in pipelines and in tankers, so you're not using the labor force of a rail system and the ability to disrupt that, to sabotage that. And of course, the original meaning of sabotage referred to the work of railwaymen and others who realized you could very subtly disrupt the movement of a train, the power of a locomotive, of a railway locomotive, with a simple disruption of its functioning. It's much more difficult with pipelines, and then it's loaded into tankers, which again are out at sea and more difficult to interrupt. They're also not constrained, as railways are, by a network of tracks, so they can go anywhere they want. And that meant if there's a strike in one place, you can route tankers somewhere else or bring them from a different point of origin and undermine any attempt to organize political action on the basis of oil. There's one more fact, of course, that many of the important sites of oil production were places that had been colonized or had been under imperial influence. So that when there were massive waves of strikes and political demands, as for example with the Iranian oil workers in the 1940s and early 1950s, one of the things the regime could do was to respond to it by turning those political demands, those national political demands for rights, into an anti-imperialist demand and nationalize the oil and say that's the issue. And that ability to nationalize and therefore direct the struggle elsewhere reflected, again, that sort of dislocated, that more spread out nature and the imperial history that had produced that. If democratic struggles were more difficult to mount when your source of energy was oil rather than coal, that not only had a depressing effect on democratization efforts, on struggles for popular political rights in oil-producing countries, it could also be used to de-democratize the countries that had industrialized first using coal. There's a simple example of that I mentioned in the book. After World War II, there was another enormous round of coal strikes across Western Europe. And ruling regimes were very concerned, not just by the strikes, but the kinds of demands that were being made by the democratic left across Western Europe. Demands for a complete change in the structure of ownership and production of wealth, that workers would share in the ownership of factories, that they would sit on the boards of management, that the profits from industry would be shared in a different kind of way. There had been similar demands in the United States, which had already been defeated. When the US looked at this and looked to its allies on the right in Europe, they came up with a solution. The solution was to replace coal with oil. The plan, of course, was the Marshall Plan, the US funds for Europe after World War II. The largest single expenditure of Marshall Plan funds and other US aid at that time was on subsidizing the production of oil in the Middle East and bringing that oil to Europe. And the justification for spending the money in that way was that this was the way to defeat the left and these new and more extended democratic demands in Europe. So this is a view of democracy that's interested in points of vulnerability, not in procedures, not in regulations, not in rules, not in people having the right mindsets, the right attitudes towards one another, but where are the points where those who want to monopolize power and monopolize the production, the enjoyment of wealth, where and at what points historically do they become vulnerable and why? And I've talked about it in the past, historically, just to lay out that simple distinction between coal and oil. There's many more levels to the story than that told in the book. Let me mention a couple of them more briefly. If, of course, coal could make people vulnerable because of the liability to a strike, there were other kinds of vulnerability for those who saw coal and later oil as a means of becoming very rich. You could do that, provided you could find a way to monopolize production or form a cartel, an agreement among producers, so that you were not threatened by the arrival of cheaper supplies from somewhere else. And the problem with natural resources, with things that don't have to be manufactured, is that you're very, very vulnerable to the sudden arrival, to somebody suddenly digging another mine or drilling another well and undermining that nice protected price you produced. And so for 500 years, coal producers in England had organized production agreements, cartels, but they only had to be within a small region because coal was never carried very far. It was too heavy, too expensive to move over great distances. Oil, as I've already mentioned, it's fluid, it's light. Unlike coal, it used to cross oceans. It still does cross oceans. It moved over great distances. And that's why almost immediately you get the emergence of a modern oil industry at the end of the 19th century. It has to become global. Why did it have to become global? Not because the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company is just a very ambitious and very imaginative industrial concern, but because of its vulnerability. The vulnerability of any producer of a very valuable source of energy, and particularly one that moves so easily around the world, of being undermined by people producing it more cheaply elsewhere. So as soon as it was realized that oil was available not only in the United States and in parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but in Indonesia and possibly also the Middle East, companies had to be formed that could operate on that much more global scale to overcome that vulnerability to the arrival of a rival, the coming of a rival who was offering it more cheaply. And so you get the entire history of the formation of this kind of multinational corporation, and later of agreements among them, and later agreements among national producer countries when many of the oil-producing states nationalize their oil. And one of the things those agreements do very early on, at the beginning of the 19th century, is they're agreements to keep most of the oil in the ground. The whole history of British and other investment in oil in Iraq in the first half of the 20th century is how to stop the oil being produced. It's always told differently. It's told as the story of pioneers going out and drilling, and whether Iran or Iraq or any of the other examples. In fact, what they were doing, we now know, was deliberately drilling shallow wells as soon as they got the rights to all the oil in the country. Drill shallow wells. Make sure you don't hit it. If you do hit the oil, plug it so it doesn't come out. And do your best, at least through to the Second World War, to prevent most of the oil being produced. After the Second World War, that's a little more difficult. There's a lot more demand from the national governments of countries that know they have a lot of oil to produce the oil. And so there have to be other methods to try and, as it were, keep oil scarce and not make yourself so vulnerable. And if you can't, if you're going to have less success in, as it were, sabotaging production, so it's now the oil companies who are using the power of sabotage. The other thing you can do is work on the other side and do your best to create more and more demand. And after the Second World War, the oil companies become involved not just in ordinary processes of marketing, but if you like, helping to build entire worlds, particularly in the US, but also in other places, organized to maximize the production of oil and produce very, very carbon-heavy forms of life. And the kinds of crises we're facing today about moving away from carbon-heavy lifestyles is not just a sort of natural process because it was a result of a natural process of expansion of use of energy, but because deliberate policies were undertaken and forms of sabotage to make the industrialized world as dependent as possible on the consumption of large amounts of oil. So simple things like the oil companies buying up public transportation companies in the city that ran electric trams and things like that and shutting them down, forcing people to become dependent on cars, on automobiles, subsidizing the building of highways, of suburbs, of suburban life in general, all kinds of ways in which the oil companies and others, car manufacturers and so on, built worlds of living, worlds of consumption, structured on the principle of very, very carbon-heavy living. One more aspect of this creation of worlds that happened around the history of the oil industry is one I'm going to talk about more in the lecture at AUC tomorrow. And this was the creation of the economy. Now, that's a strange idea. Everybody thinks there's always been an economy. Aristotle talked about the economy. In the 18th and 19th century, political economy came into being. Weren't they talking about the economy? The answer is no. No economist talked about or believed in the existence of something called the economy until about the 1940s. There's a particular way. Of course, people were interested before that in questions of material life, and they were also interested in questions of economy. But when they used the word economy in the 19th century, the word meant something that still exists in the word. The word meant to economize. In other words, to use resources prudently and wisely. So the science of political economy in the 19th century was not about the politics of the economy. It was about the politics of this wise use of material resources. There wasn't something called the economy that anybody talked about. In the 20th century, new forms of government, new forms of financial life come into being. National banks are created, central banks, centralized money systems. Those forms of money, of new paper money, have to circulate. You have to count, you have to measure, you have to develop new tools of calculation. Nationwide corporations and marketing organizations come into being and start collecting data about what people are buying and selling. And it becomes possible, gradually, on the basis of all those new forms of life, to start counting things in a new kind of way. People counted things before. There was lots of statistics in the 19th century, but they were counting wealth. They were counting material things. They were counting those kinds of expansions of goods, of populations, of countries, of territory. Those were the kinds of statistical issues that a field like political economy was interested in. What comes into being in the mid-20th century is that thing we now refer to as the GNP, the gross national product, which isn't counting things. It's counting the circulation of money through accounts, through all these new forms of accounting that come in being. And around the middle of the 20th century, that starts to become a dominant object of political discourse in a way it's continued through the second half of the 20th century. Politics is about the economy. Now this economy, this new object, because it wasn't about physical things, had a very peculiar property. It could grow without any kind of limit. Right before that, in the 1920s, economists were preoccupied with limits. There was only so much land that could be colonized. Colonialism was over. Populations weren't growing anymore. Natural resources were being depleted. Everybody was preoccupied with limits, and limits were understood as these physical limits to things. With the economy, because you're just counting it as this endless circulation of funds, you've got a new object that is magically able to get bigger and bigger and bigger. You measure it eventually through this thing called the gross national product, the GNP, and you project it forward as something capable of growth without limit, and you organize your politics around that projection. And you tell workers that if they're making too many demands, it's because they haven't obeyed the discipline of keeping that line on its graph. One has the whole sort of post-war politics of growth, both in the West and then particularly as international organizations and national banks and other organizations around the areas of the formerly colonized world adopt this same sets of calculations, the same politics of growth spread everywhere. I think one can relate this birth of the economy and this politics of growth to the new energy system that comes into being at the same time, this accelerating use of oil. And one can relate to it in two kinds of ways. First, it is available from the 1950s onwards in ever-increasing quantities and at a price that stays completely flat or even declines for several decades, up until the 1970s. So you can do a lot of things in ways that don't really have to take into account significant energy costs. And the other thing is you also don't have to take into account the fact that you're actually using up that energy. There's no charge for the fact that you're running down the Earth's stores of oil. It took 500 million years to put those stores of oil into the ground millions of years ago. And we're going to use them all up in 200 years, and we don't have to account for that, maybe 300 years. And you also didn't have to account for the other aspect that I mentioned, that in using it up, we put it in the atmosphere and we're causing damage to the ecosystem on a possibly catastrophic scale. So the economy was not only good at sort of counting things in this very exciting way going forwards around growth, around ever-increasing consumption, but also about excluding from the calculation things that before would have possibly, and now since, have to be counted. You know, we think that we fight democratic battles over constitutions, over rules and procedures. And of course that's true, and rules can be important, rules guaranteeing basic freedoms and basic rights. But I think it's also important to understand how, almost without a battle, we've come to have another kind of political constitution, of which the economy was one. A set of rules that are supposed to govern us, that have been laid down as not just a science in detail, but as a whole way of imagining material sources, the future, the forms of collective life that are possible, the kinds of demands that can be made and can't be made, and that's what the building of the economy in the middle decades of the 20th century was all about. I feel my poor translator needs to pause. I'll have a drink so she can catch her breath. Let me move ahead, because I've been characterizing a period in the middle decades of the 20th century, roughly from the 1940s through the 1970s, that was a particular moment in terms of colonialism and the rise of new forms of empire. It was a particular moment in the history of oil, transfer from a largely coal-based systems of production to ones that increasingly used a second major source of energy, that is oil, and the emergence of the economy as what seemed like the object of politics, the object around which our lives were to be organized and oriented. In complex ways, all that goes through a quite remarkable transformation somewhere between the mid-70s and the early 1980s. One can talk about, of course, the transfer and the ownership of the oil itself, or at least the rights to produce it, from the large transnational oil companies to the producer companies. One can talk about the very large rise in price that had to be engineered so that the oil companies could make that transfer, something they'd been fighting for 3-4 decades and eventually had to give in to, make that transfer without it impacting their profits anyway. The transformation where, as the oil revenues accumulate very, very rapidly in the producer countries, particularly the countries of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, there's got to be some new mechanism for taking those oil monies and bringing them back, those dollars earned from oil, and bringing them back to the West, where still most forms of production is being organized. Very difficult thing to figure out, and it caused crisis after crisis in the global monetary system, financial system in the 50s and 60s. And because a country like Saudi Arabia or Iran, as fast as it might want to develop, couldn't possibly buy things enough, fast enough, to spend all that oil money. There's only so many cars and luxury consumer goods and even factories and industrial equipment that you can import. You can only build things so fast, and you can have so many cars, and then you reach a set, with most kinds of either productive or consumer goods, you reach that limit where you can't buy any more. So you actually needed to find a new kind of good, a new kind of object that was neither a consumer object nor a productive object. And after looking around, they found one. They needed something that you could buy but not to use. Something that would be completely useless, and so useless that you could buy more and more of it and never have enough of it. And of course, by now, you've all guessed that I'm talking about this new global trade that came into being, the arms industry, that was developed from the late 1960s and onwards. And it's not just, of course, stories were told about security and threats to the oil of the Middle East and how we need to support our friends and give them all these arms that, of course, are going to be revealed as completely useless to the regimes that have them in 1979 and 1990. But they've been very useful in the meantime, and they've been useful for their uselessness, because they come in relatively small packages. A fighter jet is not that big. They cost hundreds of millions of dollars each, and you can just accumulate them and accumulate them. Of course, you have to build an entire structure of security discourse and Cold War and threats and I don't know what in order to make it look like a sensible thing is going on as the salesmen from the arms manufacturers travel back and forth making their pitches. But you organize that world of security and militarization around the business of recycling oil revenues. And of course, if you can help to sort of militarize things and keep a sense of conflict going, that'll help as well. But while that is happening, and despite all the assistance that the arms manufacturing does to the US economy in this period going forward, it becomes increasingly important for jobs in the US. Something else is happening in countries like the US and most of the other countries that industrialized first. They're beginning to deindustrialize. What's happening is, of course, that the jobs, that industries, that manufacturing is moving offshore, as they say in the US, is moving overseas. So this is actually a second or third round of this, because 100 years before, one kind of production had moved overseas, producing things needed for the first round of industrialization, cotton, sugar, and so on. So there'd been a sort of moving jobs overseas. And then another round that I've talked about in the mid-20th century of moving the production of energy overseas, subcontracting, as it were, to the Middle East and other regions, the production of energy that's going to replace or be in addition to the coal that's been the main source of energy. And now there's this third round, after the 1970s, of moving manufacturing itself to places where workers make fewer demands, particularly in East Asia, can be paid lower wages. And there's a growing sense in America. Samuel Huntington, you'll be familiar with, for talking later about the clash of civilizations. What he was talking about in the early 1980s was that there's too much democracy. He literally said, we have an excess of democracy in the US. Workers are making too many demands, and now there's all these other people. We're used to the fact that we've had unions to deal with for the last 50 years, but now we've got a women's movement, we've got environmental movement, we've got movements for sexual rights, and we've had to deal with a civil rights movement. There is just too much democracy. We need to de-democratize. We need to limit the amount of democracy. Well, it so happens that if you move all your manufacturing overseas, it becomes very easy to de-democratize, because, of course, it was that power of people to strike, to organize through energy systems and then through the forms of manufacturing connected to energy that had brought so many democratic rights in the first place. I think it can help when one thinks about this question of de-democratization to think about the predicament that rich people find themselves in. If you're very rich and you've got the money, it's no good if the money just sits under your mattress. You've got to come up with, if you like, some sort of machine where you feed the money in and it comes back with more, right? I mean, that's how the world works, or how rich people want the world to work. So you can invest and come back with that greater amount. And we can think of that machine for producing more money for rich people. There being four kinds of machines that might be available historically. There might be more, but let's stick to four. The first one, and the one that's been around a long time, of course, is property. And historically, agricultural property, large landed property. And that was a useful machine, and you could control a workforce because you were the powerful person, or you might have to fulfill certain reciprocal obligations. And you might find that when those people who did the work for you on your land became organized, there were two things you could do. In the West, you could drive them off the land and industrialize and farm essentially without people. In Egypt and many other parts, you couldn't do that. And actually, one of the incredible success stories of Egypt and several other parts of the world was preventing the driving of people off the land. And that began even back in the early part of the 20th century when peasant uprisings and revolts forced the British to adopt the 5 Fadan law, to say that no peasant can be deprived of his last 5 Fadans, if he's in debt or whatever. And they'd been forced to do the same thing in India and elsewhere. So actually, unlike the West, you have this success story of small farmers surviving in Egypt, and an even greater success with the campaigns for land reform that get underway in the 30s and 40s and result in land reforms after 1952, though, of course, they've been somewhat dismantled since. it's not only agricultural property that forms this machine, and in the more contemporary period, there's another machine that also works through property, and that's, of course, real estate and real estate speculation and putting up apartment buildings and just hoping that they will go up in value, or putting people in them to pay you rent. And in many parts of the world, the real estate machine has become one of the main sources by which very rich people put their money in and get it out. And it's, you know, when it works, it's relatively easy. It doesn't involve a lot of people and so on. So that was the first, the property machine. The second machine you could think of as the government machine, the state. Getting your hands on the organs and the institutions of state and using the holding of an office as a way of making money. And you might do that fairly low in the system and make small amounts of money, or you might be high in the system and make a lot of money. And we don't like that one so much. So whereas the people who use the real estate machine are thought of as great business tycoons, the people who use the government machine, the government machine are thought of as corrupt and so on. So you've got those two, and I think in many parts of the world, those are the two principal sort of machines available. And the reason they're the two principles of machines available is that the third one is so tough. The third machine is industry, manufacturing, organizing productive life. I think part of the way you have to understand the history of the West over the last 100 years and the history of certain other regions in the last 50 years is that you had rich people who had no choice, if they wanted to become richer, than to use the factory machine, the business of putting people to work in industrial productive labor on a large scale and making wealth out of that. Now, as I say, that's not very popular because, of course, it's enormously hard work. You've got to supervise thousands or tens of thousands of workers. You've got to deal with those demands. And you've actually got to give in to those demands because industrial workforces unionize, and because of the power of sabotage, the power to work more slowly or interrupt the smooth working of things, they can often quite effectively make their demands heard. So by and large, I think people don't like to use the manufacturing machine unless they really don't have an alternative. And everything you ever read about the inability of a country like Egypt or other places to successfully industrialize, you can't even begin to understand that story unless you understand how generally around the world the industry machine is tough work and not one that any sensible rich person would get into unless they really had nothing better to do, unless there were no good real estate deals and no good state machines and no good other things. It's hard work. And the people who got into it, you know, people, these mainland Chinese refugees on Taiwan, no land, no nothing. Other places where very effective land reform was put into place, not the Egyptian one of leaving people with 100 and 150 fidans, but the East Asian models where you set the maximum farm at 5 fidans. And you can't use that stuff anymore, and you have to get into putting people into jobs. The last one, the fourth machine, I'm going to come to in a minute, I'll call the debt machine. Before explaining the debt machine, and I want to bring this to a close pretty quickly, but I think we do have to understand the debt machine because that's where we've got to today, here in Egypt, back in the US. So what happens and this is very schematic, but I think it can help to think schematically at certain points. What happens, of course, after the 1970s in the West is that the machine that had been so successful and so powerful and that had been used to generate not only wealth but forms of democratic life, this factory machine, this putting people into industrial work, moves overseas. It's cheaper, you can make more profits, people at home are making just too many demands, let's do it, deindustrialize. But you need a new machine. There's still real estate speculation, there's still things to be made out of government contracts, military spending and things like that, but wars, but you need a new machine. And the main machine that takes over for the creation of significant forms of wealth in the US after the 1980s and that builds and builds is this debt machine, okay? You used to put people to work in your factories as productive workers, now you put them to work for you as debtors. You lend them money. Why do they take it? Well, because you've Wages are absolutely flat or even declining. Households in the US are maintaining their standard of living only by putting a second person to work. The woman goes to work as well as the male householder. They work longer hours, they work more intensively, and the benefits they get for working, pensions and many other things, all decline. So if you want to have some sense of increasing well-being going forward, and you are still promised this world of growth and improvement and things getting better, you get pulled into this debt machine. And it unfolds in a couple of ways. The first one is the plastic credit card, which begins as a kind of a luxury elite thing in the late 1970s and through the 80s, and then the credit card companies discover these new algorithms for credit scoring where they realize they can give credit cards to almost anyone who asks for them and actually impose them on them because they can figure out how much interest to charge and how to vary that using all kinds of new financial tools and gradually get people more and more into debt. And when they're maxed out on their credit cards, you come back and say, well, there's always your house. Why don't you borrow money against your house? It's this great business that we lend you money, it's secured by your house, and we'll lend you more and more and more. And the reason we'll lend you more and more and more is that we've actually developed this credit machine even better because we've invented these things called derivatives. Didn't talk about that one with the translator, but she's got it. Derivatives that enable you to inflate the underlying value of the security so that you can expand it more and more and more. So what does that mean? That means households in the US, in 1950, they don't owe anything. They've got a clean balance sheet. It goes the amount of debt, the amount of household debt, credit cards, loans for buying cars, mortgages. It gradually creeps up to about $1 trillion by the 1970s. It then starts to grow exponentially. By 2001, household debt has reached $7.5 trillion in the US. And just 7 years later, in 2008, it has doubled to $14 trillion. It's a giant financial bubble, and as we know, it bursts. The interesting thing is that it bursts for a particular reason, a reason that brings us back to carbon democracy. The oil is running out. The conventional, cheap, easy-to-reach oil has reached that point of peak that I mentioned by 2005. And although people are drilling and drilling and drilling twice as hard and at double the expense, they can't make more of it come out of the ground. And so the price of oil doubles between about 2001 and 2005. And if that's not enough, it doubles again by 2008. People living in the debt machine suddenly have vastly increased expenses for basic things like driving their cars and heating their homes. They can't pay their debts. The entire system of debt in the US goes into crisis, and you have the breakdown not just of the US financial system, but the near collapse of the global financial system. In Egypt and many other parts of the world that haven't been drawn that way into the debt machine, they have their own mechanism, and it has to do with this organization called the IMF, suffer a different way. Two related ways. And I promised you a map of the revolutionary process in the Arab world, and perhaps I'll give you that map and wrap up. The other thing that happens with the quadrupling of the price of oil is that food gets more and more expensive because we use so much oil to produce food. Well, the price of food quadruples of certain key commodities, doubles of certain key commodities, doubles in the same period as the price of oil is quadrupling. At the same time, a group of countries in the Arab world all start to earn less and less from their petroleum revenues, and in many cases have to start importing it for the first time. And the cost of importing it, they earn less and less because they are on that peak of maximum production and enter the downward slope. So the contribution of oil to government revenues starts decreasing each year, and it actually goes negative in certain places. So the countries that for maybe 50 years have enjoyed a revenue from oil exports become oil importers. So here's the map. 3 colors. One color for a group of countries in the Arab world that produce no oil. Morocco, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Jordan. The second color for those that produce an awful lot of oil and are on the plateau and relatively happy. The big producers of the Gulf, basically, and Algeria. A third color for countries that produce some oil but are past the peak. It's all declining, and several of them become importers. Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Syria, and Yemen. Of course, that's much too simple because, of course, the way that impacts in each country and the politics that unfolds is different. But what it certainly creates is a very serious fiscal crisis of different proportions in each place. And as it coincides with this doubling of the price of food, it encounters a population that is finding it harder and harder to get by and make a living. And there are different responses to fiscal crises in the second half of the decade, and some of them are ones that create the precise points of vulnerability where revolutionary action can unfold. Let me give you a couple of examples from Egypt. I mean, one, of course, is that as things get worse, the brutality of regimes increases, and people's willingness to put up with security forces that behave with extreme violence reaches a certain point beyond which it won't go. But at the same time, regimes are trying to react as they can. So one of the things you do, you accelerate the free market reform policies, and you now don't just try and privatize easy things like cement companies or tourist hotels. You actually try and sell off industry, manufacturing industry, places like Mahalla. And what you get, of course, is a completely revitalized labor movement in the manufacturing sectors of the Egyptian society. The other thing you can do is try and do something about those declining revenues. And you think, we've got to do something, the oil is declining. Let's reform the tax system. We won't reform the income tax so much because there's not all that much income to get. Let's change the property tax. And of course, who were the first workers to successfully form an independent union? It's the union of the real estate tax collectors. So I think there's particular ways you can look at this crisis that unfolds and see how the opportunities for protest and for protest to then develop into revolutionary politics can be related to this wider history of energy, of carbon energy, and of the forms of democratic politics. I've tried to tell a story where democracy is not this neat little package that travels from place to place, but it's something with a very interconnected history, that the forms of democracy that developed in some places have been closely related to forms of de-democratization elsewhere, around, among other things, the patterns of energy use. And that when one wants to understand the possibilities for democracy, historically, as they've unfolded over the last 100 years, one wants to look not just at ideas, visions, and perhaps some of the constitutions that might be based on those, but at those shifting points of vulnerability that give rise to the possibility of working for a better collective life. Thank you.
I'm not going to comment at all. Sometimes there's a tradition in Egypt where someone comes and summarizes. I just want to tell my students one thing. This is why it is important to constantly critique the majors you're disciplining in, you're concentrating in. You'll never be able to understand a lecture like this if you think it is economics or history or political science or geology or science. These disciplines are much more limiting than we think. With that, I open the floor for discussion and questions.
Thank you. I have two questions, one about method, the other about political strategy. The argument of carbon democracy is very exciting in that it opens so many possibilities to go. and the connection that you make between the emergence of mass democracy and the oil industry and the causal mechanism that is involved in the way you structure a particular energy industry, and then how oil is, it's actually very compelling and very, but the question is, what is the limit of such explanations?
Slow down.
Sorry, I apologize, I'm sorry. What is the limit of such explanations? And there is a moment in your discussion where you actually slipped into functional explanations that are, you know, somehow like, no, you shouldn't do that. So, for instance, the Marshall Plan, Europe, and you know, going to oil was a moment of that where actually, you know, the argument completely, you know, went because there could be other causal mechanisms and connections that could explain it better. The question is about political strategy. What would be the equivalent now in our time of age to the ability to disrupt that you identified in the coal industry as an important factor for political power that could actually, you know, revolutionize society? Where should we look? Is it the debt? You know, is it garbage collectors? How should we think about that? Sorry, I talked for too long.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I'd be interested to hear a longer list of that moment when the argument seems to slip. I wonder if what you're identifying as points where the argument slips are points where, as it were, I sort of identify a single human actor or group of actors, of decision makers who sort of intervene to shift things in a certain way, and that because in the rest of the account I'm not attributing things to particular decision makers, or that you sense that it's shifted, it's become functionalist, or maybe that's the point when it's become non-functionalist in a certain sense, because there are suddenly individual actors. And you may be right. I'm not sure that I think what I need to do at those points, I think in some of them, I'm trying to indeed give a rather simple and concrete example and sort of crystallize something that's much broader happening at a particular moment in the Marshall Plan. There's much more I could say about that moment. There's a very similar process that's happening in the US. In 1948, where things of rather enormous military significance are happening in the Arab world, the US is placing its own coal industry and railway industry under military control because there are so many strikes, and they actually need a similar sort of move in the US, and the railways and others all shift or begin to shift from burning coal to burning oil. So you can see that same move being made in other kinds of ways in other parts of the world. And the same week as the strikes in the US, the Iraqi oil workers from Kirkuk are marching towards Baghdad and all get arrested in Fallujah on the way and sent to prison. So I think to get away from that, I would just have to tell more stories. And in the book, I try to do it. But to some extent in a lecture, that's hard. The other question about what would be the equivalent of the ability to disrupt. There's a wonderful political theorist by the name of Robert Meister who teaches at the University of California at Santa Cruz, who I've had a couple of discussions with about some of this. And he would certainly answer you that it's, as it were, the debt machine, the financial industry that is vulnerable. And I think some of the logic of my argument is pointing that way. One of the things he's pointed out is that in this history of debt that I give, because there's an early stage where people are just borrowing money essentially to buy automobiles in the post-war period in industrialized countries. That's the one loan they have. And then there's the period of borrowing money for leaving aside real estate borrowing for housing. First of all, it's automobiles, and then it's credit cards. And beginning in the 1980s, borrowing with a credit card becomes the most important source of debt for American households. That's no longer the case. I don't know if anyone can guess what now has replaced credit cards and automobiles as the single largest source of debt for American households. Student loans, education. So in fact, we as university professors in American education have become part of the debt machine. And our students are part of that. So the revolutionary implications of that are interesting. One of that, it has become an enormous and important source of credit. The other thing, the current sort of boom that's going on is, you may have heard reports that America has suddenly become Saudi Arabia. It is now being described as the new Saudi Arabia. And it actually is the case that the last 3 or 4 years has seen the biggest increase in energy production in US history. And this is because of the exploitation of oil that is trapped in layers of rock that's kind of similar to slate in its, very, very hard rock, so hard that it can't flow through the rock. And they've developed this new method. It's extraordinarily expensive, but because oil is now $100 a barrel, and you can produce this for $80 a barrel. What it's become is an enormous industry, and the largest 10% of the land area of the US, 10%, is now leased for oil and gas extraction. It's the largest land use in the US. It's bigger than the area planted in corn or wheat or any other crop. But it's also become an enormous field of financial speculation, and another sort of round of another credit bubble is building around that because the banks needed something new to do. So I think there is a way in which, at least for some places, that system of credit is an important point. Now, I mentioned in passing that the credit system works differently in other places, and in Egypt, the way the country has been folded into this system of credit has been with the help of the IMF, and in general with multilateral lending. And that has a specific history. It's exactly the same history, the same period. The banks awash in petrodollars after the 1970s. They did what I described in the US. Generally speaking, in other regions of the world, they made these loans to governments that failed. And then they, of course, if you go bankrupt in the US, that's it. You just don't pay anything more. But governments aren't allowed to go bankrupt, and so they have to keep paying more, and everything gets rolled over. And there's been a whole history of debt, and there's been a global movement against these forms of debt. And there's now, as you all know, a set of negotiations over another round of debt. Now, I'm not saying that borrowing is some evil thing. I'm saying that that's where that's the point where pressures are at work, and where the need to rethink on a broader scale how politics works, both getting away from the sort of simple ideologies of neoliberalism on the one hand, but also a very sort of general discussion of this as just US imperialism. It may be that, but that doesn't help us understand the history of it or the detailed way in which it works and the kinds of calculations that are in place to produce people or countries as debtors in a certain kind of way, and the forms of discipline that would be imposed in order to make that debt machine work. And I think that's one point. There are others.
There was a question here first. Yes. No, up front here. And then 2 questions at the back. And then, yeah, no, behind you.
Behind you, sorry.
Sorry.
You could just stand up. Really? No standing up. Thank you for the lecture. My question is, a lot of the points you were talking about democratization involve how successful demands for benefits, welfare, are met. And that's, I guess, one way of measuring democratization. Mm-hmm. But one big problem with demands is demands are shaped by something. And so if the thing or the entity which demands are being made at are the ones shaping those demands, in effect, there seems to be just a constant downward spiral where you're not democratizing because you are telling people what they want. As you're saying, these oil companies are able to make people want more energy demanding lifestyles. So my question is, now that we are reaching this, I don't know if I can phrase this very clearly, but now that we're reaching this oil crisis, we're seeking new methods of energy. Is there a possibility for another trap, a trap towards alternative energy shaping our demands and shaping the way we want our lives to be? And is there a way to collectively avoid these traps? If that's a question that can be answered at this point.
Thank you. I think you're quite right that politics, including forms of politics that are set up according to very democratic principles, have worked increasingly over the course of the last half century in particular through this method of shaping desire, shaping demands. And I think that's one of the stories of the birth of the economy that I was talking about. It's not just creating a new sort of a more materialist form of life, but one that is then governed by the logic of the graphs you can draw of the projected growth of GDP and how this set of wage demands will throw that set of demands off course and so on. I think the job of anyone who thinks about these processes is to try and think about them not just as demands, but as demands that are shaped by these forms of specialist knowledge that sort of exist as part of a larger structure of power, which one would have to say is what a lot of the knowledge produced in universities and other places is. Though universities, of course, can also and particularly, if you like, the more sort of humanistic or critical parts of universities can create, not just in the scholarship they do, but in the work they do of bringing together people to study and think, to help people develop ways of thinking critically about that, not just universities, high schools, any other place of education if it's organized on critical principles. And I don't think it needs schools. I think in ordinary life people are pretty good at figuring out, and particularly the vast majority of the world that is essentially just trying to get by. They're pretty good at figuring it out. And then one of the histories of sort of intellectual life, particularly in the West, but I think it's happened here, is that for various reasons centers of education became less and less trustworthy from the point of view of regimes or ruling orders, and they had to develop other forms of knowledge production that would rival what was seen as the more sort of critical work done in universities. The think tank, in the form we know it, was founded in the 1970s, largely with donations from large oil companies, to give the right wing an alternative to the university as a place for the production of knowledge. And that's been enormously important in shaping political agendas since the 1980s in many countries. I think there's various answers to that. I didn't answer your other question about alternative forms of energy. There's a lot I could say about the transition to a kind of post-carbon society, but I think it would be misplaced because I don't think we have a chance of getting there unless we understand how our current carbon-based politics works. One of the most interesting movements on political campuses in the US today is the one organized by a group called 350.org, O-R-G, run by a guy called Bill McKibben, that is trying to persuade US universities to divest from oil and other carbon energy companies. And he has an interesting argument and set of calculations that go as follows. He says there are three numbers you need to think about. If we want to have any decent chance of keeping the planet habitable for human life, by 2050, which isn't very far away now, we've got to prevent global temperatures rising more than 2 degrees. People calculate that between the year 2000 and the year 2050, we can burn another 886 gigatons, 886 million tons of carbon fuels, and possibly stay under 2 degrees. However, we've already burnt almost a third of that just in the first decade of the 21st century. So now with 40 years to go, we've only got 565 gigatons to burn. The carbon energy companies have reserves, oil and coal and natural gas, of 2,795 gigatons. In other words, they have reserves that are 5 times the amount of carbon fuel we could possibly burn. And we have to find a way to keep 4/5 of that energy in the ground if we're not going to possibly destroy the conditions of the climate that have made human life possible. The trouble is that that 4/5 we want to leave in the ground is not just a fossil fuel, it's also the share price of the companies. And if you want to know why it's so hard in the US in particular to fight these battles, you have to begin by thinking about that share price, about the investors and the banks whose own abilities to profit, and particularly at a moment when other opportunities for profit through the credit boom are disappearing. So there's an awful lot at stake in decarbonizing a society. And it's not just a matter of building windmills or putting solar panels up. There's an entire structure of global finance that is at risk of disappearing if one were to decarbonize society. So it's going to be a fight.
There was 2 questions at the back and then one here. So if we can move the microphone to the back, please. Behind the camera, and then...
I've got 3 questions. One is the idea of a very short organizing principle of carbon. How do you compare it to the organizing principle of hydraulic society, explaining the state, or agriculture, creating property? Do you confirm the idea of an organizing principle to explain a historical era, or do you in your book critique it? The second is about debt, and I'm wondering if you, in the book, which I haven't read, reflect on previous cases of financial collapse historically in Europe, Holland, and other examples, and the Opium Wars and so on, and if there's anything to compare there. And thirdly, that the flip side of debt is savings. So what do universities like this one and other ones do with their savings if they cannot invest in these financial markets? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Is this argument about sort of carbon society, carbon democracy, analogous to the kinds of arguments that were made about things like hydraulic society? Yes and no. I think it is useful to think on these large scales. I think the arguments made about hydraulic societies, and of course that was an argument about ancient Egypt among other places, were made completely wrong because they were arguments about the emergence of a centralized state. And I think the actual history of ancient Egypt, and I'm sure I've got some Egyptologists in the room somewhere, so I'll be careful. But no, I won't. I think this really is the case. And it's actually from listening to some of them that I know that there's a much more interesting story to be told about hydraulic societies that's actually similar to mine, because it's about the precariousness of a hydraulic society and therefore the forms of reciprocity and redistribution that you need to build on the basis of that. And all those temples out there, what were they for? They were for storing crops. So yes, as long as you rewrite the history of hydraulic societies, you can come up with some interesting parallels. At the same time, most of those kinds of arguments, I think, were much too simple. And of course, I'm giving a simplified version of mine, but at least I'm trying to give you several layers of it, because there's coal and oil, and they shift positions, and there's transportation networks, and there's the economy and economics and social science, and there's consumption and consumer life, and there's finance, and a few other things. So it doesn't say, you know, it's not, tell me what kind of energy you've got, and I'll tell you how democratic you are. It doesn't work that way at all. Debt, yes, I think there's been an enormously interesting literature on the history of financialization, the late Giovanni Arrighi's work of that sort, the more recent work on debt, that's come from people like David Graeber, from School of Italian Marxist political economists who've been writing very interesting work, but not, to my mind, with the kind of detail one needs. So although I learn from those people, and often this huge historical scope of their work is very impressive, imaginative, I can only understand these things when I get into the details, and you know, I have to know what a derivative is in financial terms and how it works, and that kind of thing. Savings, what do we as people who might be trying to save, or universities, do with their savings? Well, I think that one can politicize the question, and of course there's quite a lot going on around the theme of responsible investors, and this 350.org campaign that I mentioned. Nobody imagines that even the richest universities were to divest from energy companies that would have the slightest impact in simple financial terms on their balance books. It's more a sort of argument by example, and trying to sort of change the way we look at carbon energy companies.
Again, I know you have the microphone, but I've been having my eye on people who had their hands before you. If you don't mind, we'll just go behind. Yes, just in front of the camera.
Just in front of the camera.
Yes.
You?
And then we go here, and then we go there.
Yeah, thank you. My question was going to be about political strategy, but I think that's been answered. But I have another one. Is it a coincidence that perhaps the three-colored map you've described is also, or can correspond to how developed or how traditional societies in those countries are? And where would you place Iraq?
Thanks. No, I don't know that the notion of developed or traditional, I'm not quite sure how that would work, and you know, where would you put Saudi Arabia? I mean, the Saudi oil workers were some of the most militant oil workers of anywhere in the region in the 1950s, and the kinds of political demands they were making, and views of the problem of US imperialism and so on. You know, where do you put that on a scale of political development? I'm not sure it makes sense to think in those kinds of terms. In relation to the question about Iraq, you know, in one sense, one can trace the Arab revolutions, the revolutionary process of the last couple of years back to events in Iraq, both forms of resistance in Iraq and the forms of political protest elsewhere, in solidarity there and with Palestine. It's been enormously important to developing forms of political action that were then able to turn and address domestic issues. But the specific course of events in Iraq, you know, Iraq and Iran together stand in a special position because they're part of that group of countries that I mentioned that have very substantial oil revenues, along with the states of the Gulf. But they're different in having and historically at least, having much larger populations and being able to develop much more extensive forms of political party, political movement, political struggle. going back right through the 20th century, a series of revolutionary moments and setbacks and so on. And so they've been the hardest countries to fit into the system of control of the oil resources of the Gulf for those kinds of reasons, because the regimes themselves had to keep following populist courses of one sort or another that put them at odds with the interests of the US in the region in a way that wasn't the case with the smaller Gulf countries. So, I would put Iraq in a certain, if one's talking on these sort of broad structural historical terms, I think one can make those kinds of arguments and patterns.
Hi, you talked about the move in the 1970s from a sort of mode of successful factory production and manufacturing to the 1980s when consumerism was debt. And I just wanted, it seems particularly prescient, I want to talk about, Britain's probably the biggest, most extreme example of that. And it seems prescient with the death of Margaret Thatcher. I just wanted to challenge, you talked about democratization. Didn't we actually see in the 1970s the word you said, successful, stuck with me, because of course in Britain the unions and manufacturing was incredibly unsuccessful. It was dragging the economy down as a whole. And actually by opening up credit cards to ordinary working people, actually you have the democratization of the free market. You're opening the free markets much more to ordinary working people who can step up on the property ladder or investments. So is it not actually the reverse of what you're saying?
Britain is a special kind of case. A couple of reasons. Because one is to do with its history of industrialization, because while it does, of course, industrialize early and develops a very significant industrial base, because of its imperial role, it's also, as it were, financialized from the start. And so much of the country's politics and the interests of those who have privileged access to wealth work through the City of London, work through the processes of debt and financialization, partly in Britain, but actually on a global scale that is out of all proportion to the country's manufacturing base. And so the kind of neglect and the rundown of manufacturing in Britain begins much earlier, begins in the 50s and 60s, and the failure of the British governing classes and others to address, as it was more successfully addressed in Germany and France, even in Italy and so on, the problems of industrial development, I think, has to be understood in those terms. And the late and unlamented by many, Iron Lady, rust in peace, they wrote on the walls where I was. Just had the complete fortune to be Prime Minister for 20 years in the period when Britain became an oil state. It was the 9th largest, 10th largest oil producer in the world. It sat on this bonanza of oil for 10, 15 years. And, it used that to pay off and to carry the costs of massive deindustrialization, costs that were actually paid in much more serious ways by the millions of people who were left unemployed. Thatcher tried to take the credit for it, though it was enormously unpopular. Nevertheless, your question, I think, does point to something important. The system of financialization, the system of drawing people into debt, the system of offering everybody credit cards is enormously powerful. You offer people the ability to live a better life through this system of debt. On the side, of course, they're paying the fees, the late charges, and ultimately other kinds of income that are keeping the system of financialization going. And it's sort of successful in a certain way on both sides, but it also has that element of a pyramid scheme because it needs to keep expanding. And it, like all, and this goes back to sort of these histories of sort of waves of financialization, when you create this bubble, many people benefit from it, but then it bursts. And if you look at what happened when it burst, I mean, think about the larger bursting in Wall Street, the collapse of the Wall Street banks and insurance companies and so on. What happens? Tens of trillions of dollars of personal wealth are wiped out. People lose their houses. The number of people without jobs, it goes from 7 million to 14 million. That's 14 million people without jobs and with very little in the way of benefits under the US system. And the bankers, turns out they're the ones who now have the power of sabotage. They simply say, give us a $14 trillion bailout, Mr. Obama, or we're going to blow up the world financial system. And they get it. You know, the system of taking capital and making it into much more, you know, has to find ways to work. And, you know, sometimes that's indeed giving people good, well-paying jobs. But otherwise, in other ways, it works by simply giving people the ability to get increasingly into debt. Now, it has to work with people's desires. For it to, you know, it has to energize people's forms of desire, need, wish for forms of better life. In order, those desires are very important to it. And one obviously shouldn't overlook the benefits that come from those when they are successful. I agree.
I'm very interested in the story you tell about the development of the oil industry and how the oil companies moved overseas. And when you tell the story in hindsight, it almost seems like it's a thought-out strategy to do so. But I struggle a little bit to connect that to what I have seen in decision-making process within the oil companies, where the international oil companies are not really usually aligned with political leadership, even in their head countries. And so in many cases, and the example that comes to mind, for example, ExxonMobil has always tried to have their own line independent from what the US wanted to do or their strategic interest. And then the other thing is they, at the end of the day, need to answer to stakeholders. So they cannot take on projects for strategic reasons that are not financially rewarding, although they go do into, for example, new markets at low, very low return, just to have the strategic advantage. But they can't keep on doing this because they don't answer to the governments, but to stakeholders. And then finally, I don't see IOCs cartelling much. On the contrary, they are in fierce competition with each other for entries in new markets and for boundary concessions, for example, especially with the entry of national oil companies in the field that are also going overseas and competing with them.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I agree with you very much. I mean, ExxonMobil has repeatedly had the kind of history you talk about. One of the most recent ones, of course, was in Iraq. They bid in the first round for oil contracts, but didn't like the terms because they were just, the oil companies were just being asked to come in, you know, like workers and just do the work and have to just take a wage for doing it. You know, you can have $7 a barrel for producing our oil. They didn't like the terms. And so they didn't bid very much in the second, or they didn't bid successfully in the second and third rounds of contracts, and those went to Chinese, Russian, Malaysian, and other oil companies. But then ExxonMobil turned around and made a deal with the regional government of Kurdistan. And didn't even tell the State Department, even though the State Department had made it absolutely clear that it did not want US oil companies making these separate deals and undermining the efforts they were making to have the Baghdad government reach an oil agreement with the regional government. And ExxonMobil didn't even tell the State Department, and then after it did, it said, you know, we're terribly sorry, but you know, we're answerable to our shareholders. And as you say, quite open about it. And that's been the history all the way through. And if you read the archives of BP in Iraq, for instance, Anglo-Persian it was then because it was in Iran and also in Iraq. And you read the British ministers who have to deal with them. You know, they're describing the BP people as the most unpatriotic, They're making money hand over fist in Iraq, and they just refuse the most elementary demands of the Iraqis for a renegotiated deal in the 1950s, and particularly in the 1960s. After the 58 revolution, the British government just can't believe that the oil companies are so intransigent, and you see this again and again. So you're absolutely right. But you see, that's my point. I wasn't explaining the actions of the oil companies as responding to some strategic vision. This thing called strategic vision, this thing called security, this thing called the whole sort of language of national security that then gets built up, is something that the oil companies themselves work very hard on, and of course their executives cycle in and out of government office and the CIA and other institutions all the way through that period and help with that work. They help fund the think tanks in Washington. The Center for Strategic International Studies at Georgetown becomes a major one that comes up with this entire doctrine of security in the Gulf, which comes to be called the Nixon Doctrine, which has a very funny history that I go into because Nixon never issued a doctrine. It was invented for him by the think tanks. He was in Southeast Asia telling all the dictators in Southeast Asia, don't worry, we'll keep funding you, don't believe all this peace stuff I had to say for the elections. And the Shah says, well, that sounds good. You really believe in supporting dictators? And they turned it into the Nixon Doctrine as this sort of global vision of American foreign policy. And it's never announced as a doctrine or even articulated as one by the White House. So a lot of work of sort of producing strategy and security and so on that then envelops US policy. And individual diplomats fight against it and say, stop selling these arms to the Shah. It's going to make the whole thing blow up. But of course, the arms manufacturers and salesmen are tied in their own places in Washington, and the diplomats are ignored, and it rolls on.
I was going to ask a question in a similar vein, but how would you respond to the criticism of overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh and putting the Shah back in power, since he was nationalizing the oil industry? Why did they get rid of him if he wasn't threatening to push prices up, and they actually like high prices?
He wasn't threatening to push prices up. Even when you get to the 1973 oil crisis, I don't think the producer states were threatening to push prices up. That was the accusation made by the oil companies. You let those people have control of their oil, they'll push prices up. What he was threatening to do was take control of production in such a way that Iran, rather than British Petroleum, would control the revenue or the bulk of the revenue, and that was the threat. The same story repeats itself in the run-up to the 73 so-called oil crisis. That gets overlaid with the story of the October War, which of course is related to the Palestine question, but what's happening in that period from sort of 1970 onwards is the producer countries are saying, we want you to pay more tax on the oil you produce. You're producing this oil and paying us a few cents per barrel, and you're making many dollars per barrel out of it in Europe. We want a higher tax rate. Now, a peculiarity of the oil industry was that in the parlance of the industry, they didn't use the word tax. They referred to something called the posted price, because in the old days, a price was posted on the gate of the refinery. And that posted price didn't refer to how much oil was bought and sold for. Nobody knew that because it was all handled within the oil companies. It just referred to the calculation of the tax rate, because the tax was a certain percentage of the posted price. And so the producer countries were saying, we want more taxes. And the oil companies would say, they're demanding an increase in the posted price. In other words, not they're saying more of the income of oil should go as tax to the country that has the oil and less to the oil company. So the media and the companies themselves report this as a price increase. They're imposing a price increase on us. They weren't. They were changing the tax regime. I think it's, they had the shared interest, of course, in restricting supply to maintain the prices as high as possible, and OPEC does indeed take over much of that work. It's always a difficult thing because each country, each individual country wants as much of the production share as they can. But it's, the battle was over the share of the revenues, not over the price per se.
Tim, first let me say, you know, we would have tried to grab you as our distinguished professor from political science, but history beat us to the draw. And secondly, that I assign your book in my Oil Curse Politics, which I'm giving this term. Now, one question I would, and obviously we have very different definitions of democracy, juxtaposing you and, say, Michael Ross dealing with democracy in a very different way. Mm-hmm. As I listen to you and read you, I get the impression that democracy is basically, it's the capacity of labor to, influence something of that sort. It has to do with activism from the base. Whereas democracy can be viewed rather in procedural terms. Now, in your discussion, what I'm wondering is whether we can sort of, on the one hand, we have these effects of oil. On the other hand, in most of the countries that we're discussing and we're interested in, we have colonial situations. And so my question is whether, rather than being an oil curse, is it not perhaps a colonial curse that has produced the consequences that the oil curse people argue about?
Thanks. You know, I must confess that your colleague Rebel Masri tried very hard to invite me in this capacity. And for some reason, I think I was too slow replying to emails, and then these guys got in there. So I wish it could have been done with your department, but maybe, you know, in a decade later there'll be a chance to come back, and I'll be happy to accept. Thank you for the question. Yes, there are indeed, you know, I suppose most theories of democracy of one sort or another tend to be these, the preponderance of the scholarship is on these procedural views. And I think that both has a certain sort of history to it of work going back in sort of constitutional theory and the theory of voting processes, all of which has been significant work. But I think it also reflects something else, which you could simply refer to as economics taking over political science, because some of these sort of first procedural views of democracy were to say, and I'm thinking of, you know, going back even to the work of Schumpeter, was say, let's think of elections as markets and as politicians, as people competing for votes, and then if we do that, we can bring in all this economic theory to explain it, and economists can take over another sphere of knowledge and explain the way it works. So I think one has to place procedural theories of democracy increasingly with the sort of revival of these Schumpeter-influenced theories in the last couple of decades in this sort of more general rise of sort of market-based thinking about processes where, you know, anything you want you will think of as a market, as a system where there are preferences and people express their preferences, and in commercial markets they do it through prices, and in political markets they do it through votes. And I think it has all the same limits, whether it's as an understanding of a way of understanding material life or as a way of understanding politics. I wouldn't sort of throw it out for that reason, because one can't, because theories of markets are part of the world we live in. Whether used in politics, I'd say politicians themselves now use those economic theories to organize the getting of votes and deciding policies. And so part of the sort of process of depoliticization itself in in many forms of democratic political process is that policies themselves are decided on the basis of sort of marketing surveys. And then sort of marketing processes are used. So the whole sort of economization of the political process. And as procedural views can't capture that, I think, well, we shouldn't throw them out. We should understand them as a set of devices that are indeed part of our political process, just as market calculations aren't things we sort of say, well, that's useless for understanding. They are part of the fabric of the world we live with. The second part of your question about, it's a colonialism, thank you, yes. Absolutely. And you know, in the book, I go into that in great detail. But I think it's important to think about the ways that while the oil industry was developed in the Middle East very much in an imperial context, one of the things producing that imperial context was oil. So to give you an example, on the eve of World War I, there's an enormous battle over this thing called the Baghdad Railway. The Ottomans want to build, with German capital, Deutsche Bank, or extend a railway they've been building that's reached already towards Ankara or Sivas or somewhere, and they want to extend it to Baghdad. And everybody who writes the history of it says, you know, this was this great imperial rivalry over the route to India. And it was one of the causes of the First World War. It had nothing to do with the route to India. It was an oil pipeline. Deutsche Bank was one of the biggest oil producers in Europe, and it wanted its hands on the oil of Iraq. It didn't want to produce the oil, which is why the railway never got built, but it wanted the concession to the railway, which if it had and nobody else had it, nobody could build, nobody could develop oil, because to develop the oil you had to be able to market it in Europe, which means you needed in those days a railway line. So a big sort of imperial context was created in the Ottoman Empire, which wasn't part directly of a German empire or a British empire. And it was all talked about in terms of German expansionism and the British controlling the Persian Gulf, but at the heart of it was this pipeline on wheels, the railway. So I think one's got to be, of course, you know, it's enormously important that these resources are being developed by entities like Deutsche Bank and BP, as it's now known, and Standard Oil or ExxonMobil, as it's now known, that could work at this global level. But I think one's got to sort of think about what it is that enables them to work on that kind of level and negotiate and get these deals and so on. And while paying attention to the imperial context, I don't think that in itself explains the particular deals that are made and the particular way the course of things unfolds.
Okay, I know we have so many more questions, but we have to start wrapping up. And I'll
try and be quick in my answers. Do you want to just take a series of final questions?
We'll have maybe two questions at the very back, and then Yusuf had his hand here, and maybe one third question there.
Okay, your argument implies that the economic politics has been running against the interest of the majority of people for the benefit of a few. I'm sorry if the question is a bit naive, but why do you think that such an analysis of yours and the data you're giving us had been hindered from coming to the surface for so long? I mean, what do you think? Why do you think the dominant rhetoric is somehow different from the argument you're giving to us?
Okay, and since should we just get...
Yeah, let's take as many questions as we can.
If you can move the microphone, please, up here, and then we'll have...
Hi, okay. I wanted to ask, I mean, looking at the talk about new sources of energy and renewable sources, and even nuclear energy, you could see the amount of involvement of universities and research in this. There's that many papers and patents and this big movement in universities. This does not happen with the emergence of oil and coal in the beginning. This involvement, this need for research and lab work for things to develop better. Do you think this makes plays in any way in how people in how the politics of those? I mean, at some point we'll have to be using only those renewable sources of energy when we run out of oil and coal. Do you think this role of research and universities will make it any different, the politics of energy worldwide? Yeah. Thank you.
And lastly,
okay.
Yusuf?
This is kind of expanding on a response you gave earlier to a question. And that was regarding the kind of manufacturing of desires, manufacturing of citizens, and kind of thinking about the shift in power from kind of the beginning of your narrative, when the general strike takes off, the end of the 1800s, to now, to thinking about how power functions. And I know in the beginning of your book, you make this intervention. You're critiquing kind of democracy promotion as a social engineering project. But at the same time, if you look at how power functions, social engineering is a key component of that. So my question for you is kind of thinking about how do we balance that? Thinking about a country like Egypt, thinking about how do we develop both mechanisms for voicing and enforcing claims for marginalized groups, but also then thinking about how do you compete against these kind of powerful engineering projects with which kind of citizens are being subjected to, whether it's to the state, whether it's through marketing, just thinking about kind of, I guess it's a question to ask you to kind of expand on what you started earlier. The second component then is kind of thinking about, again, the way in which kind of power has shifted over the time frame that you're tackling in the book. And you kind of end with it when you talk about, I guess one component is like Greenpeace, thinking about how power, like, again, coal kind of starts off with the centralization of power being a modality for kind of organizing both forms of sociality, but also forms of resistance, being able to shut down an economy. Now you have Greenpeace and other movements in the US pushing for solar and renewable energies as a decentralized alternative, one that then creates vulnerabilities in these institutions. My question for you then is kind of like, is decentralization the new kind of, for 2012, 2013, what centralization was at the end of the 18 and early 1900s?
Thank you, everyone. Okay, let's. So why is the rhetoric of the powerful so so dominant? You know, it's a question we have to keep asking ourselves, and I think it's important to understand that, as it were, it doesn't just work as rhetoric in the sense of here's one set of arguments, let me hear your set of arguments. You know, as we now know from all kinds of ways of thinking about, you know, the questions of political discourse, it works by creating entire fields of knowledge. So what I have to say about the economy and the history of discipline of economics, once you've put in place a whole system of knowledge built around this object called the economy, then necessarily those who are experts in this object will be taken very seriously. And you will set up special ministries just for that form of knowledge, just for that object, and you will make them very central and very important government ministries and so on. So the very sort of fundamental categories we use to think about collective life represent a set of sort of objects and then disciplines of knowledge that become taken for granted in that way. And that happens not just because, you know, academic disciplines and universities are powerful things, and part of the story I try and tell in the book, and I'll be talking about a bit more in my lecture tomorrow, is creating something like the economy. It's not just an academic enterprise. It's working at the level of introducing monetary systems, getting people to use paper money, putting in place the forms of calculation that then determine the circulation of that money, publishing prices in the newspaper that people can follow, and businesses can make calculations on. So it's a very rich, thickly embedded process. So as a scholar, one wants to understand the history of it. And if you just think of it as the ideology of capitalism, I don't think you'll get at the level at which it's working. So then there was a question about the new sources of energy and whether there's something different in the fact that universities are very involved in research on alternative energy in ways that wasn't the case with oil. Perhaps at a certain age it wasn't the place with coal, though even there you'd have to be careful because there was a lot of, in the 19th century, schools of mines were some of the most important faculties on universities. There was a school of mines at Columbia University 100 years ago, long before there were many other of the modern disciplines and faculties. And one finds them in all countries that had coal mining industries. And, Imperial College in London, one of the main centers of London University, is a great center for research on oil and other kinds of things. But I think it's also the case, particularly with the shift from coal to oil, that what happens is that one of the things that's different about oil is it has to construct a sort of knowledge system around it. And that's partly this creating of sort of worlds of consumption. So oil companies publish roadmaps and tourist guidebooks and all kinds of things because they want to create that. But they also have to do research because they're different from coal. When coal comes out of the ground, you know what to do with it. You put it in a furnace or a fire and you burn it. When oil comes out of the ground, it's not at all clear what to do with it. And for the first 40 or 50 years, people thought you had to put it in lamps and use it to light rooms. Unfortunately, then electricity comes along and people realize they're stuck with this product and they have to come up with new uses for it. And so they get this internal combustion thing going, and then that goes for a while. But then that's not enough, so then you have to come up with synthetics and plastics and agriculture that depends on chemicals in all kinds of ways. So the whole business of creating worlds is not just a kind of cultural business, but it's also a scientific engineering, technological process of creating uses for. So oil companies from the start, less so now, but from the start, were centers of research and design and so on. The fact that that's not necessarily the case with alternative energies partly is responsible for the fact that there's such difficulties in having them adopted, of course. Whether it'll make a difference, I don't know. Maybe I could answer that in connection with the second of Yusuf's questions about the broader kinds of politics that might go with renewable energies. So there's one kind of argument that I refer to in the book that says once we move from these very concentrated sources of energy and go back, as it were, to solar, we'll be going back to the good old days. We were solar before when energy came from crops and from trees and from rivers and winds, and we'll go back to the again and we'll get rid of these huge concentrated sources of power. Of course, it wasn't necessarily better in those old days. Perhaps we didn't necessarily live under some of the forms of oppression and certainly some of the forms of militarism that became possible with coal and oil. But there's no necessary sense that once you get beyond carbon energy, you are somehow on the path to a better and freer life. I would pose it differently, and I think some of those do, and that is to say that in the design of what kinds of energies we want to live with, democratic futures are at stake. And that includes in the politics of the process of decarbonization, because it's not You know, the question was asked about when the oil runs out. Of course, you can't wait till it runs out because, you know, as it runs out, it gradually declines, and then you're down to almost nothing. And at that point, you don't at that point suddenly switch to something else. You have to actually have started switching the moment you're on the beginning of the downward slope, as we more or less are now. Otherwise, you're in serious trouble. But I'm sure you know that's understood. But the larger point, I think, is to realize that in these kinds of very technical questions about how do we want to generate electricity, just as in technical questions about how do we want to structure loans from the IMF, or how do we want to structure the general business of financing collective life, in the technical details is a very important part of the politics. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Before thanking Tim, I want to say a couple of things. First, thank you very much for the translation.
Thank you. Yes.
And for the enormous we appreciate it very much. And also to tell you about tomorrow's lecture. It's at 1 o'clock in the New Cairo campus, the Shafiq Gabr Auditorium. And it's at 1 o'clock, and the title is Economentality. I can't remember the subtitle.
How the Future Entered Government.
And I would just like to end again by thanking Tim very much and to say, you know, this is a very special place. It's a special moment. It's in Tahrir. It's the revolution. And one could not have thought of a more radical thinker because of the very, very radical critique that hopefully can produce very, very radical politics. And what better place to listen to this than here, and what better person to listen to this kind of critique than Tim Mitchell. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.